we shall see. So I'm going to start with first slide stuff, because if I did this slide any other space, it would really make no sense. For those that don't know me, have not heard of me, it's all fine. So I'm a co-founder of Rasball with Craig Albright. I'm the stat guy, so I've created all the player raters, most of them public and free, are by me, as well as all the daily, weekly, season-long projections. Some of that, and all that's kind of partnered with Steamer, but I'm responsible for all that stuff. If you see stats projections, it's probably me. The objective of this, if it wasn't clear by this title, which is trying to create rules of thumb, which actually means you have to be able to understand it, and it's pretty straightforward. But how do you create a rule of thumb for balancing quality versus quantity trade-offs for weekly player values? So the two main ones we're dealing with are for hitters. How much quality do I sacrifice for something like a 6-game week versus a 5-game week? And for pitchers, it really comes down to that 1-start versus 2-start weeks. How much quality am I willing to sacrifice? Because at the end of the day, you're dealing with, that could be your SP6 slot, your util slot. How do I choose between these two? And what we're going to use for this data set is the 2023 Rasball Player Rater. So that was the full season. Now players were valued. And a new toy that that helped inspire the thought of this, which was a weekly player rater. So I do weekly projections, and those all have dollar values, but I've never done basically after the fact actually project weeks. So that'll be we'll continue that going into 2024. So weekends, you're trying to think, oh well, how do I see who won Fab that week? Not recommending doing it like that, but if you wanted to, you could look at these dollar values. So next question is why this should matter. Why should this matter to me and all of you? For me, and I did this as a Venn diagram, trying to be more visual. For me, I wanted to test out the weekly player rater. Analyses like this kind of help, you help determine, does anything need tweaking? Did you do it right? It also is going to help me test refine my favorite toy, which is the weekly hitter pitcher projected values. So when I see things like, oh, why is that crappy pitcher valued at $5 for that 2-start week? I have a little something. I could go back into a data set to analyze it. And the third thing is marketing, because we do sell subscriptions. They're available at rasball.com/subscriptions. So if you like this, do that. I don't know. I forget how YouTubers actually say it these days. That middle section, because I use this too, is I like to make quick decisions in weekly start, sit, and fab calls. I don't like deliberating. I don't like, fretting about it. And that includes after the fact if the outcome goes bad. I like to basically feel real confident in decisions, make them, and then whatever it is, process. As Sam Hinkie or Jeff Zimmerman would say. On your side, in terms of it doesn't impact me, I have no idea if this can be valuable. Could be really incoherent, could be gibberish. We'll see. But I would say, particularly if you don't subscribe to Rasball tools, you kind of need rules of thumb even more so, right? You gotta, if you're doing things by gut, which are, I assume if you're listening to this, you're really passionate about fantasy baseball, so your gut's probably good, but it could always be a little better. I'm going to caveat just with this player rater stuff. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just so you know where these dollar values, what they mean, and it's a good shorthand, because at the end of the day, there's generally for 5x5, you've got a lot of different factors in here. You've got to boil them down into one value. So that's what the value, the purpose of the player raters are. And these I created this in 2010 or something, and just keep building onto it. So the time periods we do, most of which are not going to factor into this, are preseason, season to date, rest of season, monthly, weekly, and per game. Default league settings are set at 12-team mixed, 5x5. The typical 13 to 14 hitters and 9 pitchers. Catchers, I give a bit of a boost to, and assume about 1.5 catchers, because we've got people who play in both 1-catcher leagues and the crazy people like myself who play in two catcher leagues, dollar values are based on that $260 that you use for auctions that was decided upon 50 years ago or so, and are hard split between hitters, pitchers, hitters, starters, and relievers in those splits. That's observed based on what people bid on. So it's basically market priced. Rostered universe are projected and used to create category averages. Basically, I'm trying to figure out, it's kind of like SGP. Mine's a little different. I don't put as much factor into replacement value. I'm looking at average values. But at the end of the day, the goal, and I'll just end this slide mercifully for 99% of you, is, if I'm splitting out the $260, if I add up, I want to split it out into each of the categories and add $1 for replacement value. And the goal should be that the value of runs, dollar runs, and dollar homers and dollar RBIs, they should be all about the same. And dollar wins, dollar Ks, dollar ERA should be about the same. And that makes sure you're treating everything equally. So now into the analysis, and we're going to start with hitters because 2 start weeks, I know that I got to save that till the end. I don't want to, got to try to ramp up on this. So for hitter quality and quantity, the key things you want to do is isolate on exactly what we're trying to do. So I'm explicitly kind of noting this to give you an idea why I frame the analysis with these certain metrics and constraints. So the first one we're going to deal with is, when you're thinking about player quality, the thing is, if you got to factor in playing time. So if you're looking at season-long dollar values, those factor in quality and quantity, right? You could be a great player, but if you have 300 plate appearances, you had negative value just on the way season-long works. Matchups would come in. We're looking at weekly data. We know there's some weeks that matchups are great, some that are poor. And the last thing, or the other 2 things, is small sample noise. If a player only played a little bit, maybe his stats look crazy good from a rate standpoint. You don't want that in the data. And positional differences, how are we going to look at this only for certain positions, that kind of thing. So what we did for the metrics and filters is say, we're going to look at, and I say we, it's just me, but it's saying we just feels like, I've got this team of people and it feels really nice. Metrics are the season-long player rater, but dollars per game. So that takes out the quantity portion of it. We're going to put a threshold of you had to have at least 100 plate appearances, not 100,000 plate appearances, but 100 plate appearances per season. And we're going to just not include catchers, just easier. And so you got some notes there on what drives it. But I'd say the one thing I'd note there is that you can't really, controlling for matchups here is really difficult. And the feeling is, well, if we average stuff out throughout the whole season, matchups balance. So we're not going to really fret too much on this. So every part of the analysis is matchups neutral. On the quantity side, we know that, well, there's some weeks where every team seems to play 7 games, others a lot play 5. How do you factor that in? The fact that you could have a case where one team plays 7 games, one team plays 5, but if the 7-game team has a platoon player and only plays 5, that's the same as a guy who plays all 5. So we want to look at player games. And this last one is kind of pretty easy to understand, but it's kind of a noisy thing that says, if I'm looking at plate appearances, most of that could have been projected, the same as with games, except we know that if a team does really well and that there's more plate appearances to go around because, they're getting more hits, they're getting more plate appearances. So we know that by using actual plate appearances, there's a little bit of bias in there, a little bit of, I'd say it's a little bit tainted. So the metrics in here are looking at games and plate appearances in 2 ways. One, subtracting versus the average of all players who had 1+ dollar value for the week. So anyone who's useful for 12 team, so use their average to kind of line it up well. And then also use that same as a ratio. So if a team played 7 games, the average team played 6 games. That could be 7 minus 6 equals 1 for games. 7 divided by 6, which is 1.16, is a ratio. Do the same for plate appearances. And the last thing here is when we're talking plate appearances, always check it against games as well, because we know games are not going to be as biased to, the 1 week where this team just blew up and got a ton of stats, or vice versa. They did awfully, and so they had lower plate appearances. This next one, and hopefully it's big enough for people to see, but don't worry about memorizing this stuff. You guys get the PowerPoint. Partially I did this because I got player weeks by splitting it up into 20. It added up to 420. I thought that was nice. I could knock a 69 into here for some of you. But this just shows for all these stats what the ranges are. So just to give you a sense, when you look at like the dollar values, the worst 5%, that top one, is negative $20 for weekly, negative $17 for season per game. And if you go down, you can see that weekly gets up to $44 for the 95th percentile, 31 for season per game. And you can see the ranges that go throughout. Like the best 5% was that a player played 1.6 games more than the average starter for a given week. But that's hard. Only the top 15% get above 1 game. And plate appearances kind of tends to be about 4 to 5 times whatever the games are. So the first actually useful thing is that quantity is about equal to quality when predicting weekly hitter success. So I'm going to start with the data up top before getting into those correlations. But what it's saying is that actual plate appearances predict weekly hitter value more than skill defined by season dollar per game, while games is about equal to the skill stat. But since plate appearances is mildly tainted because of how plate appearances correlate with team offensive success, we're going to call this one a draw. The other key stat here is that I did this 2 ways. One is looking at all player weeks, and the second is looking at the top half player weeks, because they're the top half, like kind of the guys who in the consideration set for starting. And the reason you do this is that, well, the all player weeks, that season dollar per game is telling us some really obvious stuff, that this awful hitter that, and yeah, now I can't give an example because that would really seem mean, but like, of course the Ronald Acuna is better than the awful hitter. It gets a little tougher when you're making comparisons when you start at guys that are actually near the $1 value that were potentially useful. So all the correlations there, it's harder to predict who's doing well. Looking at those charts, if you care to, they're based on their correlations are squared, and they're kind of color coded. So that green that you see under PA minus average PA and PA slash average PA is telling us that did the best of the individual stats. And the fact they get lower on the top half is basically showing numerically that insight I had up at the top. So we're going to basically now say, well, what are the factors? And these below factors are all matchup neutral. So again, hitter, pitcher, head, and this home away par factors, it all blends in. And so you'd have to factor that on top of this. But that basically for every game difference between the players is worth sacrificing $10 in this skill, the season dollars per game. Every plate appearance is worth about $2.60. The fact that, since the average game is worth a little more than 4 plate appearances, you could see that stat holds a little more sway. But again, I was saying it was a bit tainted. And I did it on ratios as well. So with the caveat of similar start percentages and plate appearances per game, if all these things are equal, along with matchups, it would say 1 extra game per week makes a replacement level starter, the guy that's like, you kind of bench half your weeks, but he's like $1. He's roughly as valuable as like your average starter on your team. worth like $12. And projecting this for half weeks, and I might be extrapolating a little much, would say that a 4-game half week versus a 3-game half week, you'd be willing to sacrifice almost $19 or so, or $8 to $18, and the math is below. On the right side, you could see some examples of each of these things. So when I say, a replacement level starter is roughly equal to 50th percentile starter, it's saying that if you gave me an extra game and they start the same amount of games, that Giancarlo Stanton last year would have been as valuable as Machado. That seems crazy. Machado's season per game looks really small in this, and the reality is that he got by a lot, at least last year, on volume. So last thing is, it's nice you create this model thing, but it'd be helpful to see actually stats. So I'm calling it sanity checking. I don't want to be putting out some model that someone could disprove real easily. If they're going to disprove it, I'd like it to be very hard. So in this one, I created 2 groups to test the factors. This 40th to 50th percentile group that was worth on average $4 per dollar per game, and a 70th to 80th percentile group that were worth $13 per game. So we've got like 150 to and 118 player weeks. So it's a pretty good sample. You could see on the right side the mix between the two. I think there's a few guys on each that might be a bit surprising, that if you were to order this, if there was just like we had that draft, the presentation before, maybe you move some guys in and out. But that's how you create the groups, and that. But it would make sense if you look at this group. Yeah, you could see why the right side was worth $13 per game. The other's $4. There are a few Rays in there. They obviously get the boost from being platooned heavily. The other thing worth noting is that if we look at that game difference and the PA difference, what it's telling us is that this was tweaked in a way. Those ranges helped set it up that the worst players had a 0.8 game advantage and a 4 plate appearance advantage. And based on that previous slide, that's worth like $8 to $10 in sacrificing that. So the question would be, okay, well, if it's worth $8 to $10 and the season per game, the difference is like $9, this should be a draw based on this. And it ends up being close to a draw. Actually, the worst players did better by $1, and they won in every stat except homers, where the 7th to 8th percentile did better. The average thing is a bit weird that the worst players did so much better there. That is something I would think if we did this simulated a bunch of times, that's something the 70 to 80 percentile guys would be better at. But what we're seeing is basically that volume is really good. So it was good basically creating this, and I could basically confirm that from a model perspective, this seems to be good for the rule of thumb. Next, we're going to go with the pitchers. And again, we talk about how do we isolate quality and quantity. Again, even though I'm the only one talking, it's a royal we. So the things we're trying to control for are the matchups, or we have to knowingly for matchup differences, small sample noise, and openers. In this case, we're going to use the dollars per game start. So that's something that will be new into the player raters this year. I do dollars per game, but we know that a starting pitcher who also did relief because they're a swingman, that's going to kind of skew the data. Middle relief does not tend to earn a lot of value per game. So we're dollars per game started. We're going to say minimum 5+ games started, and we're going to exclude anyone who is an opener. And again, we're basically saying that if we look at this with a big enough sample, any matchup differences balance out. On the quantity side, we have weekly variances in schedule, things like, well, if there's if it was a week where most teams only played 5 games, but this team played 7 and there was a 2-start week, that's more valuable than if there were a lot of 2-start weeks. There's the other case where, and we've all probably been there, where a guy's projected for 2 starts, but something happens, a rain out, an injury, something, and you only get 1 start out of it. From a metric side, I'm just using games started here. I looked at comparing versus weekly average. The differences were like negligible at best. I'd rather just keep it easy. So 1 start versus 2 start. And it's usually about 1.2 games started per pitcher. And then the reality is that you're going to have to layer on top of this the case of, well, what if the guy doesn't get 2 starts? Because that's just unclear to put into this type of projection. And my ability to project it versus yours is going to be different as well. So you could always consider that on top of this. So when looking at the correlations on quality versus quantity with pitchers, unlike with hitters, pitcher quality is a better driver. Quantity doesn't help us at all. As an isolated variable. So if you look on the bottom there, you're going to see some red on games started per week. It pretty much doesn't predict anything. So you said 2 random pitchers, 1 start and 2 start weeks. It's not a negative to have 2 starts. Doesn't tell me anything. But if you look at that season game start money, you could all 1 start and 2 start. You'll see that 2 start weeks come in with a higher number. So it's more predictive. Skill is more predictive with a 2 start week versus a 1 start week. Pretty much that helps confirm what you'd think is that, well, the bigger the sample, the more skill is going to take over. There's less randomness. Remembering that when we're talking about things like the value of a weekly start, wins plays a big role. And we know that could be lucky and fluky and stuff like that. Even ERA is going to be really fluky. So that's one thing that if I knew 1 start versus 2 start weeks, I have a stronger feel. I can use skill to a greater degree in predicting it. Like with hitters, using the top half of player weeks shows that all the predictiveness goes down. Although for 2 start weeks, it's pretty durable there. And that's, again, just because it's a lot easier to basically say, I think that Colorado pitcher is going to suck than when you're deciding between a $1 guy and a good pitcher. I put colors here so you don't have to strain too much if you don't want to look at the numbers and just you want to hear the narrative. But what I've done here is this is distributed across deciles for 1 start weeks and 2 start weeks based on the skill, season dollars per game started. So you could see that basically in both of them, the worst pitchers who qualified based on 5+ starts and stuff like that is like negative $44 on average. The best ones get to like $33. We could see that the dollars and everything, almost every stat correlates with that. It gets better, it gets greener in this case. One thing I want to call out is if you look at the 1 start weeks, just look at the money. You can see that the range is a much bigger in 2 start weeks. That the 90th percentile is worth $17, and the lowest decile is worth -13, and the spread is smaller for 1 start weeks. That is kind of how the correlation goes, right? That kind of just shows that 2 start weeks, those two things are related. If we and the reason why it's more predictable, if you look at the data, is that it's not because of ERA and WHIP. Those ranges are kind of similar if you look at the last 2 columns. With 1 start weeks being a little better because 1 start versus 2 start, you get it's harder to have 2 great starts on an ERA. So it's not the ERA WHIP. It's that if you look at wins and Ks, so the third and fourth from the right, you could see that it really it's almost near double you're getting with 2 starts. That's obvious. We would expect it to be near double. But basically saying that that's where all this why 2-start weeks are more predictive on skill, because you're basically getting better wins and Ks from your higher skilled pitchers. So to come up with a factor here, it's a little tougher than it was with hitters. And is going to sound a bit abstract, and I'm trying to provide examples here to make it less abstract. But basically, a 30th to 60th percentile starting pitcher, so SP5 to SP9 in 12 team, you can adjust this accordingly for 15. But a 30th to 60th percentile starter on 2 starts is more valuable than any 1-start pitcher that's less than 80th percentile, roughly a mid SP3. So if you look on the right, you could see for each of these ventiles, which is a decile, if you split to 20, you could see the type of pitcher. And I think I'd imagine this being a pitcherless group, you guys are more that's going to be even more vivid. You can look at that. Yes, love those guys at the bottom. As it goes up, very mixed feelings. And you get to the top of that list, you have extremely non-mixed feelings, especially if you rostered them last year. So if you look at that 1-start week and 2-start weeks here, and just kind of zeroing down on value, what it's saying is that anything at like 30th percentile, you're at a $2 start for the week. You're averaging that here, and it goes up from there. So basically saying that 30th percentile is good, 20th percentile, maybe, and then it's negative there. Not suggesting on this list that you said Wainwright, Manoah, LL, Cool Ortiz, and Tyler Anderson and Patrick Corbin. Don't start those guys on 2-start weeks. Not saying everyone. Get rid of that 20 percentile. That's going to be negative ROI. It's like the Tanner, Houck, Martin Perez, everything equal. They're borderline in 12 team. That would also make them probable guys you want in 15 team on an average matchup. That's where your threshold is. This one on a sanity checks also a little more difficult. What I did is I took the chart from a couple slides ago, lined up the 30 to 60 skill percentile on 2-start weeks, lined it up with 50 to 80 on the 1-start weeks, kind of zoomed in there, because the voice in your head, and this could be like you could picture it your voice, but it's probably some people saying, don't do the 2-start week. They're going to blow up your ERA and whip. And if you look at that group, the ERA and whips are worse, right? I'm not going to lie to you. You could see it there. They're not terribly worse, but they're certainly worse, and you're getting double helping of them, right? So that's not good. Look at the wins and Ks. You're getting near double the wins. You're getting probably like 80%, factor of 1.8 on the Ks. That's what the math is saying, is like that ERA and whip trade-off is worth it. It starts breaking down only when you get worse pitching. That last 20th percentile, where basically not only the ERA and whip gain's not worth it, but from a win and K standpoint, they're not getting you as much on the multiplier. So I have not looked at a clock this whole time. I don't have it on my phone here, so I don't know if I've gone super fast, super slow. It looks like I've gone super fast because it's 6:33 as I get out of presentation mode, but I do not have any more content. So I'm gonna.
So we're gonna hang out. That's what we're gonna do.
If there's any questions and stuff like that,
by all means, everybody, please ask away to Rudy here. I mean, okay, I want to make sure I understand this completely, at least as far as what the takeaway is.
Yeah.
For the most part, let's say you draft the pitcher inside, your top 30 starter or so.
Yeah.
I mean, if we think about it in that way, because it's going to change, of course, relative to a 12-teamer and a 15-teamer, like what that value is, right? Yeah. And you did this for more of 15 team, is that right? Or is it just kind of all percentages? 12 team. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what is the threshold that we should be really saying, okay, look, this guy is not an X top X starting pitcher, I should be favoring more of that middling to start guy.
Well, I mean, it's basically your top 30 guy. And so
Right.
in the 12 team, we're saying like, Logan Gilbert was about a threshold last year. You're
Hmm.
starting them unless it's an awful, awful matchup, right? So there's no choice. If basically your choice is you have 6 starters and that you have a 1-start Logan Gilbert and a 2-start Tanner Houck, that's not bad. What
Yeah.
you're
Right.
dealing with,
Right.
but that they're not that far from being like equal choices.
Hmm.
So yeah, that one's kind of like so I mean I think there was an equivalent of like 140 guys that start each week, I want to say. So that's
Hmm.
where like 30th percentile is trying to put a number and say like, okay, roughly like it's easier to go in there and saying like the guys that we're talking about were like the Clark Schmidts, the Tanner Houcks.
Sure.
These are guys that like and all pitchers have something that we like about them. But in general, those were guys that on 15-team leagues, you were not thrilled to start. You
Hmm.
did because once you get to SP6, SP7, the choices get slim.
Right.
And but a feeling would be like there's some people that would just draw a line and say they're never useful, or unless they have the super duper best matchup. And they're
Yeah.
saying the average 2-start week, they're usable
Yeah.
in 12-team, let alone for 15.
Oh man. So pretty much and really like so that line is not stop 30 really they should be looking to replace then. It's really around like 50, 60. Is that right?
Oh, no, that's like
Oh yeah.
80,
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
89. Like, I mean, it's pretty much anyone that doesn't disgust you, right? Like, I mean, and I mean, like, this is one where I keep trying to get a little better on the projections, but there'd be
Hmm.
cases where like a Patrick Corbin would look like it'd be an $8 guy for a 2-start week. And it's like, how could it be $8? That's like a double helping of crap.
Right, yeah.
Um, and like, so this is kind of like looking at what actually happens kind of helps, you know, shine a
Hmm.
light like, is this value right? I should expect a guy that's like quite marginal in like like I say a Clark Schmidt should be about $1 or two. That
Sure.
would be that's what I'm expecting of him. Um, Now the tough thing is like, well, these dollar values are based on what actually happened,
Hmm.
and so if anything, this is the crazy thing is like you see how bad it is per week. Like the correlations aren't super high, and
Right.
this is how they actually did
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
year.
yeah.
So add in the fact that we know less than the actual,
Yeah.
and it shows how much matchups play, but it also is, in my eyes, like you have so much uncertainty there. It just helps to basically create these kind of rules of thumb things that, again, you're like, okay, this is I've got these guys as virtually equal. Which do I do?
Sure.
And yeah, so like I totally see it where if someone wants to say like, you know, the Tanner Howe Clark Schmidt line of 2023, and
Hmm.
we don't know where I don't know where they'll be this year.
Right.
I'm going to move the line up a little bit. It's
Right.
all noise at some
Yeah.
point, but you move it up too much and you say like, if I'm not going to start him for 1, I'm not going to start him for 2. The data says no, that's really
No.
wrong.
Yeah,
Like
right.
you basically be less picky
Yeah, no, I
on the
mean, that makes all
2-start
the
guy.
sense. I guess what I'm getting at, I phrased my question terribly. Was I at like, okay, let's say we have, you're saying cool, it goes all the way to 80. And what is the data showing here that of where is that starter replaced? Like, how far back in the top X am I putting someone inside the top 80 to do instead? Right? Like I want to try and create a mental
Yeah,
map of cool. If
right,
he's inside the top 30, then that means I only go to like the 60th to do a 2-start. But if it's
right.
like
Well,
top 50, then I go all the way to the top 100, right?
yeah, well, it was, I meant, I have to look really quickly
Right.
back at the presentation, for the
So
pitchers.
sorry to make you.
No, no, so this, I mean, it's basically saying, like, let's put it this way, if you think of pitchers on your roster as SP1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
Hmm.
like, just like that,
Yeah.
it's saying, like, you'll jump your SP6 with a 2-start week is equal to your SP3 at a 1-start week.
Oh wow.
So like 3 spots,
Yeah,
which
right,
also
right.
means
And that's
like you've
doing
got
like
your
36 starter or something like that in the
right.
majors.
So you got your SP6 who would be like number 70, like, mine would
Yeah.
be higher because I'm doing the grading. And of course I've got skill, whatever.
Yeah, of
But
course.
the
Yeah.
but like your SP6 on a one start versus a free agent who's like your would be your SP8 or 9. And
Sure.
that's so it's like and then yeah, the relative value is saying like, well, if an SP6 and an SP9 on one start and SP9 on two starts are roughly equal and you've got the SP6, you don't need to go crazy on fabbing to get the SP9 to swap in there.
Mhm.
So yeah, on the weekly projections I have, it's going to factor in the matchups and everything like that. But I do think, yeah, having that kind of rubric for me is kind of helpful in being like, okay, do I think this guy is like, so within a 12 team, you could say, is this guy within 36 ranks,
Yeah.
36 in your ranking? So
Yeah.
number 80 should be about equal to 44.
Yeah. Oh man. That's so
Again,
wild. I
matchup,
know it goes against like every instinct we've had just of
but
like security, but it makes all the sense of like, hey,
because
look,
you're
the
getting,
ERA whip hit we've talked about is not worth the it is worth the gain that you will get in
yeah,
strikeouts and wins likely.
I mean, yeah, it comes
Yeah.
down to like when you look at the stats and you say like, yeah, would you have traded like, a little worse on ERA and WHIP for a win? And you
Right.
see how like hard it is to get wins
Yeah.
and build up Ks, and you're like, yeah, like I mean, like everything in balance. Maybe your league, if you're struggling in ratio,
Right.
or
Like
there's more
obviously
points
there
to
is nuance
gain.
involved. Right.
But right, but I think it's the tough thing when you're even looking at projections without a dollar value. You've just got your biases.
Yeah.
And I think there's some people that are just don't care about ratios, like
Hmm.
that are just like have this confidence that they'll average out, and so are just wins and K whores. And then
Right.
the opposite, who are just extremely petrified of ratios. And my goal is like, man, I just want to be like right. Like if I through all this analysis, you're like, okay, yeah, no, these are about equal. And then when it's equal, you just pick whatever you want.
Yeah. I mean, what's so fun to me is like I I think part of winning is making decisions you hate, right?
Yeah.
And that's the hardest part about it is just like, okay, cool. I'm just putting in, we hear a lot from earlier panels just about, look, we just gotta get the at bats. We just got to get the plate
The volume.
appearances. And like, even
Right.
though you don't like this guy, is he playing? And then fine. We just got to hope that he doesn't go like, 1 for 27 across this week or something with one RBI.
Yeah. Right. And on
So
the hitter part, yeah, I mean this is like that part's even like clearer to me that it's
mm,
yeah, again, if the guy's playing.
right,
Um, but that yeah, and that hits onto your start sit decisions if you're playing in like a DC or like a deep draft and hold type. But
right,
also for 12 team, when you've got a player pool in free agency that's deep enough, it's just the fact that it's a way of saying like just about everyone's benchable.
yeah,
And
yeah,
if the market gives me a cheap, and I mean last year it'd be a guy like Heimer Candelario,
hmm
who obviously the Reds thought fond, fondly of, but like I feel like we had him on a team and we kept bouncing in and out, and it
hmm
was always like, well, he's got the extra game this week, and or even for a half week, and how much is it worth? It's like, well, the market gives it to you for like $2. You're just getting these little edges over time. Um, yeah, so it's yeah, so I think more this tends to confirm my what I kind of expected to see, but it's still pretty startling to say like a game is worth like $10 in value because like so some of those things like a 4 start week is like if you give me a 4 start week with a scrub, a
right,
startable scrub,
yeah,
cute little scrub that is useful. It's like, yeah, I don't mind. You're gonna drop
roll right, right,
bench
right,
bench guys that aren't playing in short weeks. It's I feel like it's empowering in a way because that's so paralyzing. I mean, I don't think I would have benched. I can't imagine benching Manny Machado in a
Yeah, sure.
12-team
Right.
league all year.
Right.
But a 2-game half week, yeah, now it's like, yeah, I mean, like you have to think about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's, obviously comes down to, I don't think about it like this enough is, especially on the hitter side, is performance per plate appearance. And obviously
Well,
it's
per
a huge,
game, I would say, because the plate appearance
sure.
is tough because we know a 3 hitter is going to get more per.
Well, right. But I mean, even that is more helpful than saying if it's okay, Machado versus a 7 hitter or something along those lines. Like,
Right.
cool, how many actual plate appearances am I getting? And then what is my overall expected performance of said plate appearance? And that might give me a better understanding of the 5 versus the
Yeah.
7, that kind of
And
thing,
that's
right?
where, yeah, and
Yeah.
that's where like the games is probably even though plate appearance are more predictive, games is the easy one because you're going to
Yeah.
first see, like, so basically I would say like on a Monday to Thursdays, especially when you get like that 2-game week for a guy, it's like
Hmm.
you really should be trying to bench him. Try
Yeah.
as hard as you can, and that could mean planning ahead with your fab, or you're getting a $1 guy to just get the extra game.
Sure.
But the math on it, like I'd say it's even stronger than you would think,
Now,
because it's basically saying like, yeah, any guy, any decent guy at 3 games beats almost anyone except the elite.
sure.
With two
Right. Well, I
games.
mean, it's pretty much they need to be 50% more, right?
Yeah.
So, and I must have missed this because I imagine it was inside of it, but just comparing that 2-start pitcher versus that extra hitter for a Thursday, for example. And just let's say just assigning a point because it's really hard to calculate like between a hitter and pitcher value.
Oh, hitter versus pitcher is so
Yeah,
tough. I mean that this really is not gonna. So I
right.
mean, I think that gets more into. I think more into the team need.
Hmm.
Um, but I mean, it could be
Like,
done, but I
like,
but I think
I
that.
mean, you can think of it just like as a points league or something like that, just net gain of
Oh,
value,
well, point
right?
leagues. I mean, right, but point leagues get so tough.
Oh,
Like,
I understand.
right, so you can take these
Yeah,
stats and convert them into the
it's
points, and I
$1 or
only say that
something. Yeah.
because my experience with point leagues is that it tends to be very pitcher friendly,
Well,
and
then
that the
great. We
two
should play
start
for points leagues. What were you what were you
well,
doing?
just that 2-start weeks tend to be like 2-start weeks are like crack sometimes in some of
Yeah,
these
right. It's just
leagues.
insane. Yeah,
Eh,
it's what it is in my guillotine league. Oh yeah, that's another league I play in. Uh,
right, and
so
it
true.
is one where I tend to like I would if I played a points league, I'd want it to be more um, penalizing
Sure.
on quality, on
Hmm.
the ERA whip stuff.
Yeah, that makes
Um,
sense. We have
even
two
if
questions, by the way.
yeah, okay.
Um, I don't mean to cut you off there. Uh,
No.
so I first one's from SK Rat who asks, "Have you looked at this on the scale of quality starts rather than wins?"
No, but I can't imagine it's terribly different.
Right? I wouldn't think so.
Um, I mean, I get it. I mean, like, and I'm all for anyone that wants to do, that frames it as quality starts over wins in their league. No, I think it pans out. I could pull it, probably in the stats,
Right.
um, but yeah, I suppose. I mean, if you basically the lower the quality pitcher, the more likely they maybe don't go full 6, so they may be a little likely.
Hmm.
So let's go with the assumption that it's directionally the same,
Yeah.
but maybe you'd be a little bit more conservative on dipping into the
Right,
30th
like the
percentile
fewer
guys.
guys in the 80th percentile are
Right.
gonna have a chance at
Maybe
quality start. Yeah.
SP8 instead of SP9.
Yeah, something
But
like that. But the
yeah.
36 is gonna be just stuck in my head now. And then Madison asks, would you draft differently, like avoiding too many guys in the same team because then you can't, especially with hitters, you're gonna get the same days off.
I mean, because you're facing that dilemma of like, okay, well, if I got multiple guys on a team, I get the stack impact if when
Hmm.
things are go right. But it's both true that when matchups go wrong, right? Like, oh my God, they're
Oh yeah.
facing like a murderer's row in a bad park,
Hmm.
or the 2-game week, you face it. Um, I'd probably. I don't tend to stack too much, so I'd probably like. There's probably a threshold of like 2 or 3, but guys, like if I'm playing even in my 15-team leagues, like I'm anyone outside the first 15 rounds is pretty much churn.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
we're
there's gonna
right. I
be
mean, that's how it should be. Yeah.
so it's the number one thing is just get good players.
Yeah.
Like that would be a DFS concern for sure.
Sure.
But no, it's like just get good players. Everything after 2 or 3, yeah. If there's another hitter that's close, go with them.
Right. But then again, if you
Um,
want all the Dodgers, that's fine. You should be fine now.
I mean, there's
Uh,
certainly teams that, yeah, you wouldn't have gone wrong with.
right.
But and that there is some type of stack impact over the game. I wouldn't Galaxy. I mean, that tends to be more of a, to me, it's more a football way of thinking.
Oh yeah,
Where
no, don't bring that in here
I
whatsoever.
know, I
Don't
know.
do it, Rudy. Don't do it.
Just yeah, just be more team. Just look at just be player
Yeah, there we
versus.
go.
Don't worry